You are standing in the shadow of the great palace of Constantinople in the winter of 705 CE, and the very air seems to thicken with dread. The marble columns of the Chrysotriclinos gleam like bone, in the flickering light of countless oil lamps, their golden capitals reflecting 1,000 dancing flames that do nothing to warm the chill that has settled over the Byzantine court. From behind the purple silk curtains that separate you from the throne room comes the sound of whimpering, low and desperate, punctuated by the metallic scrape of chains across polished floors. A eunuch courtier hurries past you, his silk slippers, silent on the mosaic depicting Christ Pantocrator, but his face is pale as parchment, and his hands shake as he clutches a sealed scroll bearing the imperial seal. The double-headed eagle seems to mock him with its golden stare, promising nothing but the capricious mercy of an emperor who has forgotten what mercy means. Above it all, dominating every whisper and every fearful glance, is the knowledge that Constantine IX Paleologos has returned to claim his throne, and that the golden prosthetic that now covers the ruin where his nose once was glints like a promise of vengeance that will consume everything in its path. The man who rules the Eastern Roman Empire from this palace of nightmares is no longer the idealistic young emperor who was overthrown 10 years ago. That Constantine died in the caves of Chersonesos, his nose severed by the executioner's blade, his body broken by exile, and his soul twisted by a decade of plotting revenge. The creature who returned to Constantinople with Bulgar armies at his back is something else entirely, a living embodiment of the terrible mathematics of imperial justice where every slight must be repaid tenfold, every betrayal answered with blood, every moment of humiliation balanced by an eternity of suffering inflicted upon those who dared to defy the will of God's chosen representative on earth. Picture the scene 10 years earlier when the young Constantine first felt the cold bite of steel against his face as the usurper Leontios ordered his mutilation. In Byzantine law, physical perfection was required for imperial rule, and by destroying Constantine's nose, his enemies believed they had rendered him forever incapable of reclaiming his throne. They were wrong. The scar tissue that formed over the gaping wound became the foundation for something far more dangerous than mere ambition. It became the cornerstone of a worldview that divided humanity into two categories: those who had wronged Constantine IX, and those who had not yet had the opportunity to do so. The golden nose that now adorns his face is a masterpiece of Byzantine craftsmanship, wrought by the finest metal workers in the empire and attached to his skull by a mechanism so ingenious that courtiers whisper it must have been inspired by the devil himself. When light catches it during imperial audiences, it gleams with an otherworldly radiance that seems to promise that the emperor's vision penetrates beyond the physical world into realms where justice and vengeance merge into a single, terrible imperative. The craftsmen who created it were rewarded with gold and silk, then quietly executed to ensure that the secret of its construction died with them. The psychological transformation that exile wrought upon Constantine is perhaps even more profound than his physical alteration. The caves of Chersonesos, where he spent 6 years among hermit monks who saw his mutilation as divine punishment for his sins, became a crucible in which imperial arrogance was refined into something far more dangerous: imperial certainty. The monks' constant prayers for his soul convinced Constantine that his suffering was not punishment, but preparation, that God had tested him with exile and mutilation only to forge him into a perfect instrument of divine justice. His return to power in 705 CE was orchestrated with the methodical precision that would characterize his entire second reign. Using Bulgar allies and promises of vast wealth to mercenary armies, Constantine didn't simply recapture Constantinople, he transformed it into a theater for the systematic demonstration of what happens to those who defy imperial will. The usurper Leontios and his successor Tiberios III were dragged through the hippodrome in chains before being executed, their deaths designed not merely to eliminate political rivals, but to establish the template for the decade of terror that would follow. The great palace, that sprawling complex of audience halls, private apartments, churches, and administrative buildings that served as the nerve center of the Byzantine Empire, became Constantine's primary stage for the performance of revenge. The Magnora Palace, with its mechanical throne that could rise toward the ceiling to demonstrate the emperor's divine elevation above ordinary mortals, was modified to accommodate new forms of imperial theater. Trapdoors were installed in the floor of the throne room, allowing condemned prisoners to be dropped into chambers below where their screams could be heard, but their suffering remained tantalizingly invisible to the courtiers above. The emperor's daily routine became a carefully choreographed demonstration of the new reality. Each morning, Constantine would appear in the Chrysotriklinos wearing robes of Tyrian purple so deep they appeared almost black in certain light, the golden nose catching the illumination from the great chandelier that hung like a frozen constellation above the throne. Court ceremonies that had once celebrated the majesty of imperial power were transformed into exercises in psychological warfare, designed to remind every observer that they existed at the emperor's pleasure and could be destroyed at his whim. The systematic elimination of Constantine's enemies began with the obvious targets, those who had participated directly in his overthrow and mutilation. But as the months passed, the definition of enemy expanded with inexorable logic to include anyone who had prospered during his exile, anyone who had failed to support his return with sufficient enthusiasm, anyone whose loyalty might be questionable in future crises. The emperor's memory for slights, both real and imagined, proved to be encyclopedic, and his capacity for devising punishments that matched the specific nature of each offense bordered on artistic genius. Nikphros Gregoras, the logothete who had administered the empire's finances during Constantine's exile, was discovered to have been embezzling imperial revenues rather than simply executing him. Constantine ordered that he be forced to eat gold coins until his stomach ruptured, transforming his greed into the literal cause of his death. The symbolism was not lost on the court, and treasury officials thereafter demonstrated an almost supernatural honesty in their accounting practices. The role of Byzantine religious politics in Constantine's reign of terror cannot be understated. The emperor understood that in a society where earthly and divine authority were inextricably linked, controlling religious discourse was essential to legitimizing his actions. The Patriarch of Constantinople, who had originally supported Constantine's overthrow, found himself faced with a theological puzzle that would define the remainder of his shortened life. How to explain why God had allowed an emperor to return from the dead, so to speak, more powerful than before? Constantine's solution was elegant in its blasphemous simplicity. He declared that his mutilation and exile had been a form of divine crucifixion, that like Christ himself, he had suffered death and resurrection to demonstrate the power of divine justice over earthly treachery. The golden nose became, in this theological framework, not a symbol of his mortality, but proof of his elevation above ordinary human limitations. Just as Christ had borne the wounds of crucifixion after his resurrection, so Constantine bore his golden nose as evidence that he had transcended the laws that governed lesser mortals. This religious justification for his actions allowed Constantine to present his most extreme cruelties not as personal vengeance, but as divine judgment enacted through his imperial office. When he ordered that traitors be sewn into sacks with serpents and thrown into the Bosphorus, he was not indulging in sadistic pleasure but implementing God's will for the punishment of those who had defied his earthly representative. The theological sophistication of this argument impressed even his enemies, though it did nothing to diminish their terror. The emperor's relationships with his advisors revealed the impossible position of serving a ruler who saw betrayal in every shadow and conspiracy in every whisper. The logothete of the course, responsible for foreign affairs, lasted only 8 months before being discovered in correspondence with Arab officials that Constantine deemed insufficiently aggressive in defending Byzantine interests. Rather than execution, the emperor devised a punishment that would serve as a permanent reminder to other officials. The man was blinded in one eye and had his writing hand severed, leaving him alive but incapable of further treachery. Perhaps most revealing was Constantine's relationship with his domestic staff, the army of eunuch courtiers, palace guards, and servants who maintained the daily functioning of imperial life. These individuals, traditionally invisible in the grand narrative of empire, found themselves elevated to unprecedented importance in Constantine's paranoid worldview. A cook who prepared food with insufficient enthusiasm might find himself accused of attempting to poison the emperor. A servant who cleaned the throne room too slowly might be suspected of searching for evidence of imperial plans to sell to enemies. The impact on Constantinople's population was profound and multifaceted. The city that had once been the jewel of the Christian world, a cosmopolitan metropolis where merchants from across the known world gathered to trade in silk and spices and ideas, became a place where citizens hurried through the streets with downcast eyes and conversations were conducted in whispers. The famous chariot races in the hippodrome, once occasions for the expression of popular opinion and factional loyalty, were transformed into spectacles of imperial violence, where condemned prisoners were torn apart by wild animals between the regular competitions. Yet the city's economic life continued, even flourished in some respects. Constantine's architectural projects, funded through confiscated wealth and implemented through forced labor, created employment for thousands of craftsmen and laborers. The emperor's paranoia manifested itself in an obsession with leaving permanent monuments to his reign, structures so magnificent that they would inspire awe and terror in equal measure. For generations to come, the new palace, constructed on the site of a monastery whose monks had been too slow in welcoming Constantine's return, became a testament to imperial megalomania executed with Byzantine artistic genius. Its walls were lined with mosaics depicting the emperor's triumph over his enemies, but rendered in a style that suggested divine rather than merely human victory. Constantine appeared in these scenes with his golden nose gleaming like a halo, while his defeated foes writhed in torments that borrowed imagery from both classical mythology and Christian visions of hell. The forced labor that built these monuments came from a carefully managed system of imperial justice that ensured a steady supply of workers. Citizens convicted of even minor offenses against imperial dignity found themselves sentenced not to execution, but 2 years of construction work. Their lives extended precisely long enough to contribute to Constantine's architectural legacy, before being terminated in ways that demonstrated the emperor's absolute power over their fate. Diplomatic relations with the Arab caliphates took on a surreal quality. During Constantine's second reign, the emperor's mutilation, which Arab diplomats had initially viewed as evidence of Byzantine weakness, proved instead to be a source of psychological advantage in negotiations. When Constantine appeared before foreign ambassadors with his golden nose gleaming in the lamplight, speaking in measured tones about the consequences of defying imperial will, the effect was so unsettling that even experienced diplomats found themselves agreeing to terms they had intended to reject. The emperor's marriage alliances, traditionally a cornerstone of Byzantine foreign policy, became exercises in dynastic terrorism. Constantine's marriage to Theodora, a princess of the Khazar Khaganate, was celebrated with ceremonies so elaborate and violent that foreign witnesses wrote accounts that read more like descriptions of religious sacrifices than wedding festivities. The bride herself, terrified by reports of her husband's nature, was said to have wept throughout the ceremony, though whether from joy or fear remained diplomatically ambiguous. The growing resistance movement that would eventually destroy Constantine began not among the traditional aristocratic families, who might have been expected to challenge imperial authority, but among the middle ranks of the imperial bureaucracy. These were men who understood the practical workings of empire, who could see that Constantine's reign of terror was undermining the administrative efficiency that had made Byzantine civilization possible. They watched as competent officials were replaced with terrified sycophants, as diplomatic relationships were sacrificed to imperial ego, as the economic foundations of the empire were consumed to fund monuments to imperial vanity. The conspiracy that formed around Philippikos, a former general who had managed to survive Constantine's purges through a combination of competence and careful invisibility, was remarkable for its methodical approach to revolution. Rather than attempting a direct military coup, the conspirators spent months carefully documenting the practical consequences of Constantine's policies: the decline in tax revenues, the deterioration of military discipline, the collapse of diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. Their propaganda, distributed through networks of sympathetic monks and merchants, avoided direct attacks on Constantine's character or legitimacy. Instead, it focused on the practical argument that the empire could not survive another decade of rule by an emperor who saw governance as an opportunity for personal revenge rather than public service. This approach proved devastatingly effective, as it allowed even loyal subjects to express concern for the empire's welfare without explicitly committing treason. The final months of Constantine's reign were marked by an escalating cycle of paranoia and violence that consumed even his closest supporters. The emperor, sensing the growing opposition but unable to identify its exact source, began ordering executions based on increasingly arbitrary criteria. A courtier who smiled at the wrong moment might be accused of mocking imperial dignity. A servant who hesitated before following an order might be suspected of planning sabotage. The golden nose, once a symbol of Constantine's triumph over his enemies, became an object of obsessive attention. The emperor would spend hours each day having it cleaned and polished, examining it for signs of tarnish or damage that might indicate divine displeasure with his rule. He began to speak of it as if it were alive, a divine gift that connected him directly to God's will and enabled him to see into the hearts of traitors and enemies. The end, when it came in May 711 CE, was almost anticlimactically swift. Philippikos and his conspirators struck during one of Constantine's elaborate religious ceremonies in Hagia Sophia, using the sacred nature of the location to prevent the emperor from calling for armed assistance. The man who had returned from exile to terrorize an empire died, as he had lived during his second reign, alone, surrounded by enemies, his golden nose gleaming mockingly in the candlelight, as his life ebbed away on the marble floors of Christianity's greatest cathedral. The aftermath of Constantine's assassination revealed the true extent of the psychological damage his reign had inflicted upon the Byzantine Empire. Philippikos, proclaimed emperor by popular acclaim, found himself ruling a state whose administrative structures had been hollowed out by a decade of terror, whose diplomatic relationships had been poisoned by years of erratic behavior, whose military discipline had been undermined by the promotion of sycophants over competent officers. Yet perhaps most significantly, Constantine's reign had demonstrated the fundamental fragility of imperial authority in a system where absolute power was limited only by the emperor's own psychological constraints. The golden nose, removed from his corpse and melted down to fund Philippikos' coronation, had come to symbolize not the triumph of divine justice, but the terrible consequences of unchecked imperial will. The mosaics and monuments that Constantine had built to celebrate his reign became reminders of a different lesson entirely. The new palace, with its scenes of imperial triumph, was converted into a monastery whose monks were instructed to pray for the souls of all who had died during the Reign of Terror. The mechanical throne in the Magnora Palace was dismantled, its pieces distributed to churches throughout the empire as a reminder that earthly power, no matter how technologically enhanced, remained subject to divine judgment. The Byzantine chroniclers who recorded Constantine's reign struggled to find appropriate language for describing what they had witnessed. Traditional historical categories seemed inadequate for an emperor who had combined political competence with psychological instability, military success with administrative chaos, religious devotion with systematic cruelty. Their accounts, written in the safety of subsequent reigns, tend to present Constantine as an aberration, a cautionary tale about what happens when imperial authority is corrupted by personal obsession. But the truth revealed in their more candid moments suggests something more disturbing, that Constantine IX was not an aberration, but a logical extreme of the Byzantine system itself. In an empire where the emperor was understood to be God's representative on earth, where imperial will was theoretically unlimited by any earthly authority, where the machinery of state existed primarily to implement the ruler's personal vision, the only real constraint on imperial power was the emperor's own character and psychological stability. Constantine's mutilation and exile had stripped away the social and psychological constraints that normally limited imperial behavior. Faced with the choice between moderating his actions to maintain broad support and using terror to enforce absolute obedience, he had chosen terror. The golden nose became a symbol not just of his personal transformation, but of the empire's vulnerability to rulers who confused personal vengeance with public justice. The merchants and craftsmen who had prospered during Constantine's building projects, the soldiers who had been rewarded for their loyalty, the religious officials who had found theological justifications for imperial policy, all discovered that their complicity in the Reign of Terror provided no protection when political winds shifted. Philippikos' government, seeking to demonstrate its break with the previous regime, was almost as systematic in punishing Constantine's supporters as Constantine had been in eliminating his enemies. The cycle of revenge and counter-revenge revealed the deeper structural problems that would eventually contribute to the Byzantine Empire's decline. In a system where political succession depended on force rather than law, where administrative competence was subordinated to personal loyalty, where religious authority was used to justify political decisions, the empire's stability was always at the mercy of individual rulers' psychological stability. The golden nose, melted down and forgotten, had served its purpose as a symbol of the transformation that exile and mutilation could work upon the human soul. But the lessons of Constantine's reign, encoded in the traumatic memories of those who survived it, would influence Byzantine political culture for generations to come. Future emperors would remember what happened when imperial power was exercised without restraint, when personal grievance was elevated to the level of state policy, when the mechanisms of government were subordinated to the psychology of revenge, standing, once again in that shadowed corridor of the great palace, listening to the whispers and footsteps that echo through marble halls, where Constantine IX once held court, you can almost feel the weight of those lessons pressing down upon the stones themselves. The double-headed eagle still glares from imperial seals and banners, but its golden eyes seem less confident now, more aware of the fragility of the power they represent. The purple silk that once draped Constantine's shoulders has faded and been replaced, but the color itself carries memories of the man who wore it as both crown and shroud. The mechanical throne no longer rises toward the cathedral ceiling, but the space where it stood remains somehow charged with the echo of imperial ambitions that consumed themselves in the very intensity of their expression. The Byzantine Empire would survive Constantine IX by more than 7 centuries, but it would never fully recover from the demonstration of its own potential for self-destructs. The golden nose had reflected more than lamplight. It had shown the empire its own face, distorted by power into something beautiful and terrible, and ultimately unsustainable. In the end, perhaps that reflection is Constantine's truest legacy. Not the monuments he built or the enemies he destroyed, but the mirror he held up to imperial power itself, showing how quickly divine authority could become diabolic obsession, how easily the machinery of justice could be converted into instruments of vengeance, how the same qualities that enabled an emperor to reclaim his throne could ultimately consume both the ruler and the civilization he claimed to serve. The golden nose gleamed for only 6 years, but its light illuminated truths about power and corruption that no amount of imperial propaganda could obscure. And in that illumination, the seeds of future revolts were planted, future emperors were warned, and the empire itself was forced to confront the terrible mathematics of absolute power, that it corrupts absolutely, and that the most dangerous enemies of any throne are often the ambitions and obsessions of those who sit upon it.